Hey everyone, welcome back. You know how everyone's always talking about the future of energy? Well, we're going to actually really dig deep into that today. Specifically, we're going to be looking at solar power versus nuclear fusion.
Right.
And I mean really deep. We didn't just skim a few articles for this one. We dove headfirst into a sea of research, over 1,200 peer-reviewed articles, technical reports, expert interviews, all that good stuff. And get this, to make sense of it all, we brought in the big guns machine learning.
Yeah, we really wanted to go beyond just, your typical expert opinions and cost projections. We wanted to see what the data was actually saying, the hard numbers.
Exactly. So starting with solar power, I mean, you see it everywhere, right? It's already a major player. I think I read somewhere that in 2024, we had over 1.5 terawatts of global solar capacity. That's a lot of panels.
It is, and the cost has just been plummeting. Since 2010, it's dropped by 88%. That's huge. And according to IRENA's 2024 report, we're looking at a levelized cost of energy, the LCOE, of about 3 cents per kilowatt hour.
3 cents? That's crazy cheap. And the best part, it's ready to go now. We can deploy it super quickly. It's perfect for those smaller, localized energy systems. So it's like solar's the reliable workhorse, getting the job done. But then there's nuclear fusion, which has always had this almost mythical status, the holy grail of energy.
Yeah, the forever promise, right. But lately, it's been getting a lot more attention for good reason, too. I mean, ITER made some pretty significant strides in 2025. They were able to maintain that plasma confinement for longer, getting us closer to a sustained fusion reaction.
It was the big hurdle. Why?
Exactly. And we've also got all these private companies like Commonwealth Fusion Systems and Tokamak Energy, really pushing the boundaries with new innovations and investments.
Right. There's a real buzz around it now.
Yeah.
And the payoff could be enormous, right? We're talking practically zero emissions, barely any long-lived radioactive waste, and an insane amount of energy from a tiny bit of fuel.
Exactly. So you've got this mature technology in solar, which is still rapidly improving, up against fusion, which is more in the R&D phase, but with the potential to be a total game changer.
Right. That's the million-dollar question then. How do these two really stack up against each other?
Right. So that's what we wanted to look at. We dug into their technological readiness, how economically viable they are, how well they can scale up to meet global demands, and ultimately what all this means for the future of energy.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. How ready are these technologies right now? We'll start with solar. We all know those typical solar panels, but is the tech still evolving?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just standing still. Standard silicon solar cells, the ones you see everywhere, are now getting over 24% efficiency. That's pretty good. But what's even more exciting are these new perovskite tandem cells. Researchers hit 33.7% efficiency with them in 2025.
Wow, so almost a 10% jump.
Yeah, and that could be a game changer in terms of how much power we can squeeze out of each panel.
Right. But as we slap more and more panels up, aren't we going to run into issues with actually getting all that power to where it needs to be?
That's a big one. You see, as we install more solar, we're also seeing some problems with integrating it into our existing power grids. We actually looked at some data from 2024, and it turns out something called curtailment, where excess solar energy is wasted because it can't be used or stored right away, was a real issue.
Oh, so it's we have all this clean energy, but we can't even use it all.
Yeah, and it's not just a small problem either. In California, the curtailment rate hit 8%. And in Sichuan province in China, it was a whopping 12%.
Wow. So that brings us to the whole energy storage problem, right? Because the sun doesn't shine all the time, and we need to find ways to store that energy for when we need it.
Exactly. And there are a few contenders there. Lithium-ion batteries, those are pretty dominant for short-term storage. They've got a 92% market share. But for longer-term storage, we're seeing a lot of interest in technologies like redox flow batteries.
So it sounds like we'll need a whole toolbox of different storage solutions, depending on the situation.
Most likely, yeah. Now, switching gears to nuclear fusion, it's a whole different ballgame, technologically speaking. It's all about controlling the superheated plasma where the fusion happens. And there are two main approaches: magnetic confinement and inertial confinement.
Okay, break those down for me.
So magnetic confinement, that's where you use really strong magnets to trap and squeeze the plasma. You've got devices called Tokamak's ITER being the most famous example. Their goal is to achieve a Q value of 10.
A Q value?
Yeah, it's basically a measure of how efficient the fusion reaction is. A Q of 1 means you're getting out as much energy as you're putting in.
Okay, so ITER shooting for 10. That's really good.
Oh, yeah, that would be huge. It would mean we're getting way more energy out than we're putting in, which is what you need for a viable power source. And then you have stellarators, which are kind of like tokamaks, but with a more twisted magnetic field. The Wendelstein 7X in Germany, that's a stellarator, and it managed to hold the plasma for a full 30 minutes in 2024.
Wow, that's a long time.
It is. It's a big step forward. Now, inertial confinement, that's a whole other approach. It involves using lasers to blast a tiny pellet of fuel, causing it to implode and fuse.
Ah, like what they're doing at the National Ignition Facility.
Exactly, the NIF. And they actually achieved something incredible in 2024, scientific break-even. They got out more energy than they put in. They hit a Q value of 1.5.
That's awesome. So are we like on the verge of fusion power then?
Well, not so fast. The challenge with inertial confinement is getting those reactions to happen reliably and repeatedly. You see, the NIF, they can only fire their lasers every few hours.
Ah, so it's not like flipping a light switch.
Not yet, no. But what's really interesting is the amount of private investment that's flooding into fusion research. In 2024 alone, it was a staggering $6.2 billion.
Wow. So there's definitely a lot of faith in its potential, even if it's still a ways off. And what about the fuel? Like, where does that come from for fusion compared to solar?
Well, that's one of the really appealing things about fusion. One of the main fuels, deuterium, is found in seawater. It's incredibly abundant, practically limitless. And then there's tritium, which you can actually breed from lithium. The IAEA actually thinks a fusion power plant could even produce slightly more tritium than it uses.
So basically, we're talking about a nearly inexhaustible fuel source.
Right. Compare that to traditional nuclear fission, which relies on uranium, and there are concerns about how long that supply will last. Some estimates say only a couple of centuries.
Okay, so fusion has that long-term advantage when it comes to fuel. But what about the cost? Like, how does it compare to solar right now?
Well, economically, solar PV has a definite edge. It's sitting pretty with an LCOE of 3 cents per kilowatt hour, like we said.
Which is super cheap.
Yeah.
But we were talking about potential issues with the supply chain for solar, right?
Yeah, that's another wrinkle. There are some vulnerabilities there that we need to think about.
Like what?
Well, for one, you need super high purity silicon to make solar cells. And then there's silver, which is used in those solar modules. Each module needs about 85 grams of silver. And right now, a lot of the production for these key materials, it's concentrated in China.
Okay, so not only do we need to secure those materials, but there's also this geopolitical factor to consider.
Exactly. Now, looking at the economics of fusion, MIT put out a report in 2024 called The Future of Fusion. And it offered some, let's say, realistic perspectives. They basically said that fusion is probably going to miss that crucial 2035 climate target window when it comes to making a real impact.
Meaning it won't be deployed widely enough to really make a dent in emissions by then.
Right. And they also predicted that the cost of fusion energy probably won't dip below 7 cents per kilowatt hour before 2040.
That's more than double the cost of solar right now.
It is. And they also brought up a really important point. The regulatory frameworks for fusion power, they're way behind the technological advancements.
So even if we solve the scientific challenges, we might get bogged down in red tape. Okay, so we've talked about the fuel, the cost, the tech itself. What about the environmental impacts? Because fusion has this reputation for being super clean, right?
It does, and in terms of greenhouse gas emissions during operation, it's pretty much as good as it gets. But we also have to look at the whole life cycle of solar energy, including the emissions produced during manufacturing and the materials used.
Right, so it's not a totally clean slate either.
No technology is. But fusion definitely has the potential to have a much smaller footprint, especially when it comes to long-lived radioactive waste. That's a big advantage over traditional nuclear fission.
Okay, so both technologies have their pluses and minuses environmentally. What about things like land and water use?
Yeah, unfortunately, our sources didn't give us a direct comparison on that, but we do know that large-scale solar farms can take up a lot of space. Fusion plants, on the other hand, because they're so energy dense, they would need a much smaller footprint for the same output.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered a lot of ground here, the technology, the economics, the environmental stuff. Now let's zoom out and talk about the bigger picture. What does all this mean for policy and ultimately for you, the listener? One of the things that made our study unique was how we use machine learning. And not just to crunch numbers, but to analyze all that qualitative research out there.
Yeah, these advanced machine learning techniques, they were really helpful in making sense of this huge amount of information. We use sentiment analysis tools like Fader and BERT to get a sense of the overall tone and optimism within the research community, and they performed really well on our test data.
So, were researchers generally positive about the future of solar and fusion?
Yeah, there was a lot of optimism. And we also used topic modeling with tools like LDA and BERTopic to identify the key themes and the things that researchers were focusing on. And these tools were great at understanding even the super technical language. And to figure out potential adoption timelines, we used LSTM neural networks and Facebook Profit. It was pretty cool to see all this come together.
Sounds like it. And did all this data crunching and analysis, did it support our initial assumptions?
It did, actually. One of the key findings was that solar PV is likely to remain the dominant player in the near term, say between 2030 and 2040. And that's because of its well-established supply chains and its continued cost declines.
So business as usual for solar for now, at least in terms of its leading role?
Pretty much. But then our second hypothesis, that was about nuclear fusion. We thought it could really shake things up after 2040.
Right. There was a caveat, right?
Exactly. It all hinges on a significant boost in global investment for research and development. We're talking on the order of $50 billion per year.
Wow. And that's coming from both public and private sectors.
Yeah, it would have to be a joint effort. Without that level of commitment, wide-scale commercial fusion power could be pushed back significantly.
So a lot is riding on that investment. And our findings about the timeline, they seem to line up with what other big energy organizations are predicting, right?
They do. The IEA, in their Net Zero by 2050 roadmap, they projected that solar PV could be providing a whopping 35% of global electricity by 2050. But they also said fusion probably won't be commercially viable until after 2045.
Okay, so we're all kind of on the same page there. But the IEA also raised a concern that we talked about earlier, the supply of critical minerals. They think that could become a major roadblock for solar's continued growth.
Yeah, and that just underscores how important it is to consider these supply chain vulnerabilities when making policies for both technologies. And what's interesting is that our analysis showed this has been kind of overlooked in previous research, which tended to focus more on the costs and technical feasibility.
So we need to be thinking more holistically about the whole picture.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the individual listener. What does all this mean for their energy future?
Well, in the short term, it's likely they'll see more and more solar power popping up, and that could lead to lower electricity bills in many places. But figuring out how to smoothly integrate all that solar power into the grid and how to store the energy, that's going to be crucial for making sure the lights stay on.
Right, because even if we have tons of solar panels, we need to be able to use that energy when we need it,
Yeah.
even when the sun's not shining.
Absolutely. Now, looking further out, fusion has the potential to be a real game changer. Clean, practically unlimited energy, that's the dream. But we're still a ways off. It needs major technological breakthroughs, and it needs that huge investment we talked about to really take off.
So a lot of exciting possibilities, but also some serious challenges to tackle.
Definitely. And it's also important to remember that the ideal mix of energy sources is probably going to look different depending on where you are in the world. The amount of sunlight you get, how much land is available, what the power grid infrastructure is like, those are all going to play a role in shaping energy policy.
Right, there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap of our deep dive today. Solar power, it's the front runner right now, thanks to its affordability and how easy it is to deploy, but it faces some hurdles when it comes to grid integration and getting those key materials. Nuclear fusion, on the other hand, it's got huge long-term potential with its promise of clean, abundant energy, but there's still big technological and economic mountains to climb before it's ready for prime time.
And our ability to make sense of this complex energy landscape, it's really been boosted by using machine learning. Analyzing all that research data gives us a lot more confidence in these insights and projections.
Absolutely. So to leave you with a final thought, something to chew on, given everything we've talked about, what role do you think solar and fusion should ultimately play in shaping the future of energy? And what are the most critical areas where we need to focus our research and investment to make that future a reality? It's a complex issue, but understanding the pieces is the first step towards building a truly sustainable energy future for everyone.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.